Welcome back to Paws, Mongolia podcast. Today's episode, I want to look at some of the world's great museums and masterpieces from slightly different angle. And I wanted to start with Russia because the Hermitage has such as an interesting collection from the ancient Eurasian world. It takes this subject somewhere completely different from the European paintings that most of us immediately associated with museums. One object I found particularly interesting is actually not a painting at all. It is a saddle cover from the Pazurik culture in the Altai Mountains from the 5th century BC. So we are talking about something around 2,500 years old. It's made from felt and horsehair, and the design shows a griffin attacking an ibex. It's quite dramatic when you look at it. The bodies are twisted and intertwined, and there are other stylized animal heads around the edges. According to the Hermitage, scenes of predators attacking herbivores were an important motif in ancient Altaic art and were found more widely across the city and world. The museum even discusses the possibility that these scenes had symbolic associations with seasonal change, although that's an interpretation rather than something we can know with certainty. What I found interesting about this is that the art is actually sitting on something connected to the real animal. This isn't a painting hanging in somebody's house. It's a saddle cover. Horses were part of everyday life, transportation, and survival. And at the same time, people were decorating horse equipment with these elaborate images of other animals. And then the Hermitage has something even more famous from Pazurik, this extraordinary ancient carpet. The Pazurik carpet dates to around the 5th or 4th century BC and was found in a burial mound in the Altai. The Hermitage describes it as the world's oldest known pile carpet. Around its borders, you can see fallow deer, griffins, and 28 figures of men with horses. And the technical side of this is amazing. The museum calculates that the carpet contains more than 1.25 million notes. So I was thinking about how much work that is. These days, if we buy a rug for the living room and maybe spend 20 minutes deciding wherever it works with the sofa, someone thousands of years ago was involved in producing this incredibly complicated object with more than million notes, and animals were in a major part of the design. We don't know actually exactly where the carpet was made. The Hermitage says an Iranian origin has been proposed. Central Asia is another possibility. And it's also possible that nomadic craftspeople copied aspects of Persian design. Honestly, I think that uncertainty is important because ancient cultures weren't living inside our modern national borders. Objects, ideas, designs, and people moved. And that's one reason I wanted Russia in this episode. When you look at these collections in Hermitage, you are looking into this enormous cultural space connecting Siberia, the Altai, Central Asia, Iran, and the steppe. Coming from Mongolia myself, I found that much more interesting than treating Asian and European artists if they developed in completely separate rooms. Animals travel through these cultures too. deer, horses, ibex, birds of prey, big cats, imaginary creatures. They keep appearing, but not always for the same reasons. Then if we travel from St. Petersburg to Paris, suddenly we are in another completely different animal world. At the Louvre Museum in France, you can find Egyptian galleries containing mummified cats, and I mean actual mummified cats, not simply paintings or sculptures of them. Some date to Egypt's late period, roughly 664 to 332 BC, and they are currently displayed in the Louvre gallery called Animals and Gods. There is even a cat-shaped coffin in the collection. Now, whenever ancient Egypt and cats come up, we hear this sentence that Egyptians worshipped cats. I used to hear that all the time, but the real history is much more complicated. Cats were associated with religious practices and particularly with the goddess Bastet. But saying that Egyptians simply worshipped every cat as god doesn't accurately describe Egyptian religion. And I actually prefer the complicated version because it tells us that relationship between people and animals wasn't one thing. An animal could be physically living around humans and also have a religious identity and appear in art and be part of burial practices. These things could all exist together. The Louvre's own collection gives you a sense of just how seriously these objects were made. One cat coffin from the late period is made from copper alloyed with gold and has inlaid eyes. It's not a casual little decoration. So when I was researching this, I kept thinking about how familiar part of this feels even though the religious context is completely different from ours. These days, we still put enormous emotional and financial effort into representing animals. People commission portraits of their dogs. They have paintings of horses. We buy wallpaper covered in birds and cushions with leopards and sculptures of animals that have never been anywhere near our homes. Obviously, I am not saying that's the same thing as ancient Egyptian religious practice. It isn't. But this desire to keep making images of animals around us is incredibly persistent. And that's the where I wanted to go next. Because once you get into European painting, some animals begin to feel less like an archaeological object or religious figure, and much more like somebody you could almost meet. And I was thinking if I were in London right now and I wanted to do this episode as museum visit, I would probably go to the National Gallery and look at the Whistle Jacket. This is George Stubbs' enormous painting of a chestnut racehorse painted around 1762. If you have never seen it, what's unusual is how little else there to distract you. There is no rider sitting on the horse, no aristocratic owner posing next to him, no battle happening in the background. You have this huge horse against a very plain background, and he gets the painting almost entirely to himself. And this is actually quite current because the National Gallery just had a George Stubbs exhibition from March through May this year, 2026. They also brought in another monumental Stubbs horse portrait called Scrub, which is still privately owned and has very rarely been shown publicly. and displayed it so visitors could compare it with Whistle Jacket. The National Gallery says these were two of the earliest life-size British horse portraits to show the horse without the human presence. Stubbs was extremely serious about horse anatomy. In the 1750s, he spent about 18 months studying and drawing horses anatomically and eventually published the anatomy of the horse. But when I look at Whistle Jacket, anatomy isn't really what I am thinking about. I am looking at his face. That's what's interesting about some animal paintings. You know intellectually that you are looking at paint on canvas, but you start deciding what kind of personality this animal has. Maybe that's partly us projecting human ideas onto an animal. But Stubbs clearly paid extraordinary attention to individual horses. Then in Amsterdam, there is another painting that I really like for completely different reasons. It's called The Threatened Swan, painted by Jeanneslin around 1650, and it's in the Rijksmuseum. This swan is not quietly floating around looking elegant. She is defending her nest from a dog. Her wings are spread and she looks absolutely furious. Later, the painting acquired a political interpretation. The swan came to be understood as representing the Dutch statesman Johan de Witt, defending the country from its enemies. But here is the part one didn't know in 1800. This painting became the first acquisition of the National Kunstgalerie, the institution that eventually became the Rijksmuseum. So the collection history of one of the world's major museums begins with an extremely angry swan. I like that fact much more than I probably should. And this is also where you see how people can take an animal image and keep changing its meaning. Asselin painted a swan defending a nest. Later generations looked at it and saw national politics. Art doesn't stay under the artist's control forever. Then we go to Madrid and Las Meninas. Everybody talks about this painting for very good reasons. Velázquez painted it around 1656. There is the young Infanta Margarita, her attendants, Velázquez himself, the mirror at the back, with the king and queen reflected in it, and this strange question about who exactly is looking at whom. But there is also a very large mastiff lying on the floor. The Prado identifies the dog as one of the figures in the scene, and one of the court figures, Nicolista Pertesuta, has his foot against the dog. And once you notice that dog, it's difficult not to keep looking at him. He isn't the subject of Las Minanas. He is living at the bottom of one of the most analyzed paintings in Western art, apparently much less concerned with the intellectual mystery of the composition than everybody who has been studying it for the last few centuries. That's something I enjoy about animals in old paintings. They can make extremely formal historical scenes suddenly feel ordinary. You have royalty, elaborate clothing, court etiquette, and this enormous historical distance between their lives and ours. And then there is a dog lying on the floor that I understand immediately. And dogs show up constantly in European portraits. Sometimes there was symbolism attached to them, Sometimes they communicated status, hunting, culture, or companionship. I feel like most artists seems genuinely interested in the animal itself. And if you spend enough time looking through museum collections, you also start finding animals where you didn't expect them. They are hiding underneath tables. They are being held by children. Also, birds are appearing in domestic scenes. Horses are carrying people through battles and landscapes. Wild animals appear in paintings made by artists who may never have encountered the living animal themselves, which raises another interesting question. What happens when artists begin painting animals not as background decoration, but as subjects worth looking at in their own right? That's where the story starts feeling surprisingly modern. And gradually animals begin to occupy a different place in art. They were no longer simply part of the background. Artists around the world began painting them as individuals with character, movement, and presence. And that is where I want to leave the museum today, looking at animals not as decoration around human history, but as subjects with the history of their own. And thank you again, and I really value the time you spend with me. Wherever you are listening from, I hope you all have a wonderful summer, and I will talk to you again soon. Thank you so much for listening Paws Mongolia podcast. Follow this podcast, write a review, and share it with your friends and family. Together, we can grow this podcast and bring more awareness and compassion into the world.